So now I'm switching this around. Instead of saying IQ, what is it good for? I'm just saying it's the IQ test, what is it good for? So whether you agree that it's measuring innate ability or whatever, we have a test. And this is what it's good for to start with. First of all, we can gather a lot of information in a short period of time. If we were able to have a teacher observe a child for a full school year, or maybe not that long, that teacher is able to give us as much information about his vocabulary and his memory and his visual skills as we're able to get on a test. But we are able to gather a lot of information in an hour by administering a test like this. And again, that's the foundation for what else we learn about his learning, his memory or his communication or his academic skills. But also, it helps us determine where the student fits with respect to his peers and his grade expectations. So, of course, we're always looking at the child as an individual and where is this child's abilities and where is he going and how much has he progressed. But when it comes down to it, you still have to answer the question, but is he meeting the expectations for a grade 1 class or a grade 5 class? You need that information as well. So testing can help us with that. And then it can predict where the student may excel or where he may struggle with academic achievement. And as I've already suggested, it's very useful to provide clues as to other areas requiring investigation. And I'll give you many examples of that as we go along. And monitoring his development over time. What's happening to his skills, and I'm going to spend more time on this in a minute, are his level of abilities going up? Are they staying the same? Are they going down? What's happening over time? Because particularly with students who have FASD, we notice some shifts over time that we don't expect. And most important probably are the qualitative aspects of his performance. Like the little boy who I said, okay, this is a race now. Well, that was a qualitative observation that he needed that little extra push to do well. So the qualitative aspects can be, and often are, as important or more important than the scores themselves. All right, so as we go through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to give you some test scores, and they're based on the Wechsler scales. Wechsler is the most widely used test. There are other tests that people use for different reasons, but anyway, that's what this one is about. And Canadian norms, and also the IQ test is co-normed with the achievement test. That is, the same children took the IQ test as took the achievement test, reading math. So that means you can compare them directly, because if you use one test and another test that's normed on a different group of children, it isn't quite as comparable. Verbal comprehension on the WISC, which is the school-age children's version of the test. So verbal comprehension has 3 parts to it. One is vocabulary, and so several people mentioned the importance of vocabulary. You are impressed when a child has a good vocabulary. What is the meaning of obstreperous, for example? That wouldn't be the first item on the list, but you know. Anyway, so vocabulary is important, but also you have to listen to how the child uses the vocabulary, because sometimes they use these flowery words, but then what he says doesn't make sense at all. But he has the vocabulary. But vocabulary is extremely important, and that stood the test of time, going right back to those really early tests. And then now you have to use your vocabulary and reasoning. How are tea and coffee alike? So to give the category, they're beverages, for example. Or another type of answer might be, oh, well, they're hot. Okay, maybe not quite as good an answer as they're beverages. So there's a way of scoring qualitatively the kind of answer the child would give you. And then comprehension. Why do we do certain things? Why do we do this? Why do we do that? Why do we wear shoes? So those 3 parts get combined into what's called the verbal comprehension score. And then we have the other side of the coin. On the WIPC, as I showed you before, it's called performance, but in the updated test, they call it perceptual reasoning. So perception meaning looking at things and figuring things out and reasoning. So the actual block designs on the list don't have little maple leaves, but I thought we could have maple leaves on our blocks. They're actually red blocks, different sides, red, white, and half red and half white are the blocks. And so it's presented either as a model, I make the design, and then the child makes it, or as you get into more advanced items, it's a picture. And then picture concepts. On this test, it's sort of like similarities because you have these pictures here and these pictures here, and the child is asked to choose one here that goes with one here. And for all of these tests, there's always practice and teaching items. So the child hopefully chooses the squirrel and the bird because they're both animals. And then matrix reasoning, I don't know if you can see this, but there will be a grid like this, and then which one of these is going to complete the pattern. And so this one, I think, has a high level of reasoning, and this one may be less so. And this one doesn't have so much reasoning as it does perception. So you try to figure out, on the basis of what the child does, okay, why was this hard for him? Why was this easy for him? Because it doesn't always turn out exactly the same. Well, anyway, those subtests combine for perceptual reasoning. Then we have working memory, the digit span I mentioned, and letter number sequencing. They have to get letters and numbers in order. And then processing speed, it's paper and pencil. So the test itself is only how fast can you do paper and pencil activities. And that's not all there is to processing speed, because there's language processing speed, thinking processing speed. So then when we get all done, we have one score for the verbal comprehension for each one of these, and then a combined score. And the combined score, which is called the full scale, isn't an average, but there's a statistical way that it's done, but it puts all these things together. And so then these are the classifications. So I already told you about the average range. So for the examples that I'm going to be giving you, it's good to keep in mind that average range. It's good to keep in mind this 70 or 70 and below range, because that's the low range. And then you can just sort of imagine those higher numbers and how they might be on that curve. So keep in mind average and low, and then just a general high. So when it comes to cognitive ability, or IQ, with FASD, what we have found is that there's a broad range, and it can range from that mentally handicapped low range to above average. And that above average part has always sort of puzzled me. It's like that slide that I showed you before. Well, how could he possibly be FASD if his IQ is so high? Well, I'll give you some examples about how the IQ can be high, but it doesn't measure everything. And in fact, you could have an FASD diagnosis. But more generally, the IQs tend to be average to low average, not really above average. And oftentimes, that verbal part is lower than the nonverbal part. But there's no single profile that identifies people with FASD. And why should there be? Because in addition to the alcohol exposure, we have, for example, heredity. So what heredity did this child come with before the alcohol exposure? It helps explain one of the findings that we've seen very often in the children who have been referred for FAS. And these are interesting children because oftentimes they do have repeat assessments. I'm just going to go back to this slide now. Which is that we sometimes see children in those early years, preschool years, up to around age 5, that are doing extremely well. And then they get to school and they get older and it falls off. And this is when I began seeing this, and you read this research and so on. It's sort of troubling, and it makes it difficult to, what message do you give to the families? Because on the one hand, you want to say, your child is doing so well. Look at his vocabulary. Look at his motor skills. Look at his visual skills. He's right where he should be. But he's had this prenatal alcohol exposure. But we don't want to say, well, guess what's going to happen later? And we don't know what's going to happen later. But you can't at age 5 say that all is well and you don't have to worry. So when you receive some of these reports, it will say, this child is doing well in these areas, but needs to be considered at risk due to this known prenatal alcohol exposure.